And good evening again. We're off to the Savvy Street Show again. Today we are back to the series on philosophy and psychology instead of the deep state. And today we have two very eminent philosophers, and their names are Professor Rasmussen and Professor Den Uyl. So Douglas Den Uyl taught philosophy and was department chair and full professor at Bellarmine University before joining the Liberty Fund, where he is now Vice President Emeritus and Benjamin A. Rogge Resident Scholar. Douglas Rasmussen is Professor Emeritus, Department of Philosophy at St. John's University, New York City, Senior Affiliated Scholar for the Institute of Economic Inquiry at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and Senior Scholar for the Institute of Economic Studies Europe. Den Uyl and Rasmussen are also co-authors of several books and journal articles, including a trilogy of books on freedom and flourishing. And they are Norms of Liberty, The Perfectionist Turn, and most recently, The Realist Turn, published in 2020. And they're also co-editors of the Philosophic Thought of Ayn Rand. Welcome to the show, Doug and Douglas.
Thank you.
Okay, so today's topic is flourishing, on which you've written, I guess, thousands of pages. In particular, the virtue ethics of flourishing. So maybe I could start with trying defining flourishing. I mean, I had to come up with one, and you tell me if that's not quite right. So I came up with actually two. If I was describing a state as an end state or a steady state, then I say it's a default state of serenity, punctuated by self-inflicted pleasures, undergirded by resilience. You know, the pleasures may be of any kind: skiing down the slopes, enjoying your work, and undergirded by resilience because you don't want to be knocked out of the default state by the slightest misfortune. And otherwise, if I was describing a process, the process would be an actualizing of one's humane potential. And the qualified humane is because we also have a potential to become a really clever bank robber that can evade the law. So over to you, gentlemen. How would you define flourishing? And what I said, was that somewhat right, or right on the ball, or wrong?
You want to start, Doug?
Okay, I'll give it a start. I don't think what you have in your definition is anything particularly objectionable or something to be upset about. I just think it's a very almost concrete type of definition, in that it specifies certain psychological states in that, and I think those states are there. But I think a more general definition has to be found. Also, there's just a general question here of defining that we would probably have to talk about. I think the way I would want to do it is, I'd want to say that, to begin with, human flourishing is a cognitive independent reality. It's a certain mode of living, a certain way of being for a human being. And this way of living is constituted by the use of one's rational capacity, which we consider to be self-directed, to attain basic goods and virtues that are necessary for human beings to complete or actualize or perfect themselves. So I suppose if we had to give a definition, it would be something like the human flourishing is the exercise of one's own practical wisdom, and that has to be unpacked quite a bit. I think that would include many of the things you talk about. Regarding the use of the word human potential as opposed to humane potential, I would be inclined to think that there's a difference between a possibility to be one way and a potentiality to be one way. When we talk about human potentials, we're talking about human potentials as they are for the sake of a certain way of being or a certain way of living. And so the ability to what shall I say, be a serial killer or to not pay attention to the world are certainly possibilities that people have, but they're not a part of what I would call of actualizing or perfecting one's nature as a human being.
Okay, thank you for that.
I might come at it a bit differently, though I would agree with everything that Doug has said. First of all, flourishing isn't defined by pleasure, though pleasure perhaps is accompanies flourishing. So it's not the mere presence of pleasure is not a definition that one is flourishing. I used to tell my students that Aristotle suggested that you really can't be happy or eudaimonic until you mature, and that the only mature person in the room was me. None of them were yet at that stage, yet all of them experienced, I'm sure, plenty of pleasure on the weekends. So you have to, it's a process of, as Doug says, using practical wisdom and learning how to use it well. That takes a bit of time. So that's part of what flourishing is. It's not the mere presence of happiness, I mean of pleasure. So I would add that to it as well.
Yeah, and that reminds me, to the extent that we understand pleasure in terms of desire and the satisfaction of desire, the Aristotelian and indeed the Thomistic tradition tends to talk about flourishing or the perfecting life as the life of right desire. So the point is, desire has to be present, but we need to know what kinds of desires for what things, in what way, in what manner, and in what circumstance. And so the point about there's sometimes when one should be serene and relaxed, and there's sometimes that maybe one should be quite agitated and involved, depending on the circumstance and the situation. I always like the old phrase there, you don't want to get angry, generally speaking, but there is such a thing as righteous anger too, and it is appropriate under certain circumstances. So there's a lot to this this notion, no doubt about it.
Thank you. Now I'm going to refer to one of your 1999 papers where you said human goodness is something ontological, and ontologically considered, human flourishing is an activity, an actuality, and an end or function. So firstly, I wanted to understand what you mean by ontological, and secondly, we could discuss whether flourishing is, how is it simultaneously an end goal, a process, and a steady state?
I'll take the first part of the question, and I'll let Douglas take the second. By ontologically considered, remember the first thing we said a minute ago was that human flourishing is a cognitive independent reality. It's something that exists in a certain manner, in a certain way, independent of what we think or hope or want or wish. Now, wanting and wishing and acting and choosing may be a way of attaining that, but that doesn't determine what that reality is. So when we're talking about reality, we're talking about the way things are. Ontology is the study of being, more precisely, it's the study of the basic ways that things can exist. A nice metaphor that's often used is that when you do ontology, you're talking about the ontological furniture of the world, the fundamental things that are. And what you can do, like, for example, Aristotle did this when he talked about the categories or the ways of being, that something is an entity, that he called it a substance, and then you can have a quality, a quantity, an action, a relation, etc. And these are fundamental ways of being. When you're doing that, you're doing ontology. But also you can talk about ways of being that transcend or go across the categories. For example, a relationship of potentiality to actuality, the relationship of something to an end, or you could talk about different types of activities. And so when we say human flourishing ontologically considered, we're not talking about it now in the way in which you might talk about it if you're a psychologist or even an ethicist. You're talking about it just insofar as you're concerned with the way this type of reality exists. Now, to say that is a very, very wide abstraction, and you have to say a lot more to specify it. Doug?
Yeah, so going to your points, maybe an analogy to a golf swing we've used before, where you practice the swing, so it is a process, but hitting it well is the result of that process, and that's the end that you seek. And it's something that you're doing, the very act that you do when you practice the process itself. So it becomes, and a steady state is if you've got the swing down pretty well, you continue to use that swing the same way, and that's what we mean. Now, of course, all states of real beings have, run into impediments, but basically it is a process that one gains, one expresses, and then one uses in the same way.
Okay.
Yeah, another thing you can often say about it is that if you're exercising your reason in a manner to know the goods and achieve them in a proper way, and you've established the virtues that support this, then that establishes a state of character or a way of being, and an old-fashioned way of saying that this disposition becomes second nature. In other words, what you're really doing in a sense is making your soul, making yourself, but making it in the sense of developing those ways of acting, those ways of operating that will allow you to act in an appropriately way. So that imagine someone being tempted by stealing someone's wallet. If you're really virtuous and you see someone's wallet there, the idea of even stealing the wallet wouldn't even occur to you. It's not, because it's not even in your purview, so to speak. And so if you have to struggle all the time to act virtuously, then you haven't yet made yourself virtuous.
So this is how you know that you are now in a state of flourishing, because you don't have to struggle to avoid the bad things, or there's a little bit more to that. How do you know I am in that state? How do you know you are in that state? And occasionally there may be some misfortune,
sure,
or an
no
incident
doubt about
knocks you out, and then you got to come back to that stage.
Well, I mean, it's going to be a process of practicing, like anything else. One makes what Aristotle called a second nature, as Doug said. If I buy something from Doug and he pays me too much in change, and I have to think about returning the extra, I'm not there yet. If I just hand it to him, I sort of know that I could reflect on that act afterwards and say, yeah, I guess I'm approaching honesty and so forth. I don't, it becomes, the second nature is a kind of a process that just one takes and then perhaps reflects upon as one reflects upon anything else.
I was hoping you would be there yet, or not there yet, was sort of every time Doug and Douglas make a transaction, you got to count the money.
Wouldn't be much of a friendship, would it?
Yeah, indeed. Now, there's a lot of controversy over objectivity and subjectivity, and whether flourishing is objective or subjective or both. And I sort of try to illustrate with, let's say there are two brothers. One of them wants young people, and one of them wants to be a musician. The other wants to be a lawyer. And so the musician, the one who wants to be professional musician, has to practice 7 or 8 hours a day, and the lawyer has to do study. And yet it would be morally wrong for the lawyer or the one aspiring to be one to be doing music 8 hours a day, but he can objectively observe that his brother ought to do what he's doing. So it's individuated and subjective to that extent, but the process of and the general principle of what you ought to do is objective. So you can kind of understand the third party perspective as well. Is that sort of getting there to that, drilling through the objectivity and subjectivity?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I understand you correctly, the lawyer has to realize that 8 hours of music, again, might be fun, but it's not getting him where he knows he needs to be. Same with the brother who might be interested in discussing legal issues. Well, that's fine, but that can't be the bulk of what he's practicing in order to be a good musician. Now, maybe each of them is somewhat wrong about what they do, and they try the other and realize, well, I'm actually not interested in law. I'm interested in music like my brother, but that would be the process of practice that one engages in order to settle one's dispositions.
But it's
Yes.
objective to the extent the other brother can understand why someone needs to practice music even though he doesn't.
Right, because people have a certain dispositions which have natures. Music itself has a nature, law has a nature. You need to reconcile those in some way. So it's objective in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, another way of saying all this is to say that human flourishing is a type of reality that is constituted or made up by other activities that are in the pursuit of certain things. For example, friendship or knowledge or being productive or being creative. We talk about different things. And this can be manifested in different ways, being a lawyer, being a musician, etc. Now, these general statements can be understood as true and thus objective and not just a matter of opinion. How they are put together in the form and the balance in terms of the amount of time, the amount of effort that's appropriate for one brother or another brother is also objective in the sense that it must be appropriate for that person, for that individual, or you could say for that subject. But you don't mean by subject there whatever one feels like, whatever one wants, but finding what is appropriate. So objectivity, to use the terminology that you introduced, Vinay, is that it can be understood working at a sort of more abstract or general level, and then you can make it more and more specific. And so there are certain facts that are about us that might be unique to us and not applicable to everyone else. So objectivity is not necessarily the same thing as universality, which is, of course, a problem, I think, with other types of ethical theories.
Yes.
I hope
Thank
that
you.
I hope that helped.
Yes, it does. And,
Might add there's a personal dimension to this because my first year of college was as a music major, and
it's interesting.
where I thought I wanted to go. And then I realized, well, I just don't have quite the talent and interest in it and move myself in another direction, which I'm happy I did. It didn't mean I'd love music any less. It just meant I realized that my talents, if you will, were not suited for that particular project.
Oh, we're glad he did. His talents at philosophy certainly are quite immense, and we wouldn't have had the books that we had today if you'd stayed in music as a major. So, and in speaking of your bio, we spoke about you are co-editors of the Philosophic Thought of Ayn Rand. So I wanted to turn to Ayn Rand for a little while. She uses the phrase that every valuation needs a valuer. And so how do we reconcile that with flourishing being an ultimate end? I think Rand talks about life itself as an ultimate end, which is very objective in terms of pulse, or someone not having a pulse. Someone is alive or dead, they can't be half dead, although we use that expression in English. How do we reconcile that flourishing is an ultimate end? It's kind of almost universal for all mankind, independent of the valuer.
I suppose what you could say here is that we understand flourishing as the telos or ergon, the end or the function of a human being. And this is something that we take human beings, because they're living things, to have as their natural function or their natural end. It's in some respects like Rand when she says the life of any living thing is its ultimate end or end. But the point, of course, is that life doesn't exist in the abstract. There's no such thing as denatured life. It's always life as some kind or sort of thing. So that when we start talking about human flourishing as the ultimate end, it is always in relation to some human being acting, some human being choosing. And what we're saying, of course, is that the ultimate end of that choosing, of those efforts, is the flourishing life. Whether the human being understands it or not, another issue. So in one sense, then, you still have the agency or the relation between the ultimate end and the living thing, or in this case, a human being. So it's not as if when we're saying human flourishing is an ultimate end, that it's some kind, to use Randian language, some kind of intrinsic end that exist apart from the relationship to human beings. But it is an end in the sense that it's there, whether one acknowledges it or not. And of course, that's an interesting question in how you interpret Rand. I'm going to let Doug take over in a minute, but I just want to say something about the philosophic thought of Ayn Rand. That is, we make it very clear in that book that we understand and interpret Rand as advancing an Aristotelian alternative, or maybe we should call it a neo-Aristotelian alternative. And that's how we interpret her. We interpret her that way because, by our judgment, the type of arguments that she makes make more sense, have more going for them if they're interpreted that way. Rand, I think, was a very successful writer, an unbelievable novelist, et cetera, et cetera. She had to take her view or vision of the world and put it in a form that's very concise. And because of that, a lot of times she didn't go into all the details that a philosopher would go into. And so there's different ways of interpreting her. We've just always said she makes the most sense if we see her in the neo-Aristotelian tradition.
In other words, you see her, if I were to use essentially as a flourisher.
Yeah, but I mean, she adds a dimension to things that's important. Her emphasis on individuality, her emphasis on the markets and how productivity and being an entrepreneur and all of that can be an expression of human reason and insight. You just don't have to be an abstract philosopher, etc. I mean, she's got her finger on the pulse of that. She obviously understands the effects of collectivism and socialism on an economy. She understands what it does to a culture. So she's definitely saying a lot of things in that tradition that a lot of people don't. But in terms of speaking more philosophically, there's just lots of things that are left, what shall I say, undeveloped, or not as, not developed as much as I think we think they need to be to make her case. And so we've taken on, when we talk about her, an interpretation of her. We don't see ourselves, however, as advancing her philosophy, because we're not that sure what that philosophy is on some really crucial issues. We're more concerned with advancing what we think is true and trying to show why it's so.
Okay, so can I say that you are interpreting her based on her corpus as a whole, as against the single essay objectivist ethics, or you can actually take that interpretation from that single essay alone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Let me just go back one step, though, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Flourishing is valuing. It's a process of value.
Good.
And it's important not to think of flourishing as a kind of, maybe this came from your original question, a kind of end state that doesn't do anything. It's an activity. It's not an, I don't know what I want to say. It's not an end in the sense that it doesn't move any further, that you've got it, like you possess it and there's nothing more to do. No, it is a process of valuing and acting. That's very important to keep in mind about it.
Yes.
Thank you. And I believe in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, Eric Mack had alleged that she shuffles between a kind of a flourishing and a survivalist end goal. Did you find that to be the case in your interpretation of the objectivist ethics?
Doug actually knows, he's debated this in print, so I'll let him finish. But I never quite saw her as a survivalist, which made it probably easier for me to run the Aristotelian background. I understand what people say when they look at her that way. That didn't hit me really as where she was going with it, but that just may be my failure to see certain passages that others think are survivalist indicators.
Yeah, I I always thought that there were gaps in the argument, but I never thought that the gaps couldn't be supplied. If you are familiar at all with some of the things she says in her introduction to objectivist epistemology, she talks about how the process of forming a concept of something requires that you omit the measurements or omit the
Yes.
specificities. And when she talks about life as the ultimate end, and she uses the word nature all the time and talking about the nature of living things, when she says life is the ultimate end, she doesn't mean, and I'm ignoring and denying all the specific ways that things can live. Rather, when she says when life is the ultimate end, it must be life as a kind or sort of thing. And so the life for amoeba is not the same as the life of a plant or a dog or a cat or a politician or a human being. Ha ha. But so I mean that's one thing about her. But there's another issue here that is not really technically under the flourishing versus survival issue. It really has to do with whether a moral standard applies to one, whether one chooses it or not. And if human flourishing, or to use her term, man's life qua man, if that's the ultimate moral standard, then to say it's one thing to say you have to choose to achieve or maintain or enjoy or engage in that activity. Okay. It's another thing to say that that standard is only applicable if you choose to have it be applicable to you. And there is certain interpretations of Rand that argue that she should be interpreted as almost what I'd call an existentialist or a voluntarist, where you have to choose to let the moral standard apply to you before judgments can be made about you. And there are about 3 articles in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies where I discuss that. Eric Mack also mentions this in his shuffling article, if I recall. But that's another issue. But there's a lot of details to that.
Okay. So you have to choose not only to live, but to live as man qua man, and then the morality applies to you.
According to that interpretation, I think Roderick Long, in an essay in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, called it the official interpretation. Whether it's official or not is a matter of debate. And again, our whole point on all of this is that we're interested in Rand. She's always had worthwhile things to say, but we're more interested in developing our own point of view and our own account. I mean, there are things in her ethics that, and maybe Doug will pick this up too, that she doesn't, I think, sufficiently talk about. For example, human sociality, yes. The virtue of phronesis or practical wisdom. There's a lot of that, and it's really always. And she doesn't really, though she does talk about individuals, she doesn't have much conversation about how what she calls the virtues, how they have to be concretized in a person's life that much. I think in her novels she does a better job of that.
Indeed.
I don't have much to add to that. I will say that I've spent some time, as has Doug, in the Scottish Enlightenment, talking about how human beings relate to each other, and I think there's a lot of value in doing that is missing from Rand. But she had a way of expressing things that were partly defined by the times that she lived in. So I've never really been upset about this lack because she dealt with a time when everybody said sociality was everything, individualism was nothing.
Yep.
So I
Sure.
think that he
Yep.
went at it the right way for the time. But, you know, as a philosophical doctrine, it needs a bit more punching up on the sociality part.
Yes, and let's not forget she grew up in Russia just at the time the Red Army took over, and you know her
Exactly.
family was affected.
Yes, big time.
One last question on Rand before we move on. Would you say she kind of misunderstood the concept of teleology as expressed in Aristotle?
Given her time, probably not, because the notion that teleology could be biocentric and natural, and really supported by, for example, as some people have pointed out, even by Darwin, in terms of there being a natural selection for the life of a thing. That idea hadn't come about in the time when she was writing in 60 or 58, the objectivist ethics. It's interesting to view, by the way, though, if you read her review of the 1960 book. The book is called Aristotle by the philosopher John Herman Randall, and the discussion of biology and teleology in that. There you can see a notion of teleology that is later going to be recognized as having a legitimate place in the world. But I must say that this issue is still quite controversial in some quarters, and so I mean there are some that would say that no, it's you're being anthropomorphic or anthropic in talking that way. I think there's a famous line by the biologist Haldane who said, biologists treat teleology like a mistress. They cannot live without her, but they don't want to be seen in public with her, and so I think that's an interesting phenomenon. Let me mention the work of someone at the university. I think he's retired now, but James Lennox has done some interesting work on this whole account of teleology. Even though I'm not saying that he would necessarily agree with us, he's someone that I know we've learned from.
Yeah, and I think Rand deserves more credit for bringing into the forefront the Aristotelian tradition than she's given credit for. There are plenty of other people doing it now, but we know plenty of people. We're old enough to have seen people at young ages get into this because of Rand. And I've always thought it's been a bit unfair not to recognize her influence, even if she didn't come out as an Aristotelian scholar per se.
Yeah, right.
That's definitely fair. Let's go back to what we spoke about earlier about using the word humane. You know, I was using it as the humane actualization of, or actualization of humane potential, because in your writings as well, it comes to, as Aristotle said, we are rational animals, but you know, when you stress the animal part of it rather than rational, how do we, in definitional terms, prevent the actualization of bad potential? In a sense of what we spoke about, you know, if somebody is manipulating other people to get more power, like become a dictator or serial bank robber or whatever, that is a potential. And to become a clever bank robber, you got to actualize that potential.
Right. I'll talk about it more abstractly, and then I'll let Doug take over. First of all, when we talk, one way of understanding the nature of something is as a determinate set of potentialities. So potentialities can be understood in relationship to the nature of something. So there are potentialities have to be understood in relationship to a certain state. And if potentialities, what we're talking about, are a type of potentiality for the mature state of an entity, then what constitutes maturity is going to set a limit or going to determine The potentialities, or put it the other way, those potentialities will determine what maturity is. That being said, a potentiality is a more narrow form of a possibility. In other words, possibility can be a much wider set of things that an entity can do. And just because an entity can do that doesn't mean that that will be an example of actualizing a potentiality, if you get what I'm saying. A potentiality has to be understood relative to an end that it has. And I think a lot of times people just don't understand the difference. Now, we could get more specific on it. Doug, do you want to take on here or not?
Yes, I guess there's a certain amount of skepticism one should have to say that one was sort of born to be a bank robber. There are probably potentialities that one has in one's dispositions that could perhaps lead in that direction, but the whole point is you use those in a certain kind of way. So perhaps you have more of a tendency towards anger or something. I don't know what it would be that would get you there. But the point is you work with those dispositions and try to sort them in such a way that you flourish. I think that answers partly the specific question. I think when we talk about potentialities, we're not talking about anything as concrete, I don't think, as becoming a bank robber or necessarily even becoming a musician. It really depends on what sorts of dispositions one has to work with and how one works with them. That's where the practical wisdom comes in.
Right, and if you are, let's develop this a bit more. Let's say that you have a tendency to lose your temper, or you have a tendency to maybe want to slough something off and not follow through and all of that. And you could let those tendencies develop. Just as virtue can become second nature, vice can become second nature, and you can so develop a character that it really works against you achieving something. Now, the point I think that Doug was getting at is that if you start to let those things develop, for example, losing your temper too much or sloughing off so much, then you're going to find that incompatible with the achieving of other goods and things that you need. And so you can find out, not only am I losing my temper here at the guy in the football game, but I'm losing my temper at the guy in the car, and now I'm making gestures and driving recklessly. I mean, think of road rage and things like that. And people who don't can often let themselves develop in ways that way, and usually when you come up in conflict with other things, there's a correction. But people don't have to do that. They can ignore that and make a royal mess of their lives.
I could, but if I may, driving at a person who is seeking power, being a president or prime minister, and they're manipulative, and sometimes, or often, people who are manipulative succeed in a conventional sense, succeed at life by manipulating other people. They're not killing them, they're just not very honest people. And that has become part of their nature. Are we saying that and they may be very successful in a conventional sense, they may be CEOs of very large corporations or presidents of countries. Are they necessarily unhappy, or they're not flourishing? Or are we just saying that in a definitional sense?
Necessarily, this is an interesting point, because one of the things we try to do, I think, which is not to use the word happy and flourishing necessarily together, because it gets very confusing. Happiness is going back to our original opening, really just referring to pleasure. Maybe this guy gets a lot of pleasure beating up people. I don't know. It doesn't follow from that he's flourishing in the sense that we would mean it. And my guess is that it doesn't really fit very well with other dispositions he's got or she's got. I was going to say earlier, and Doug may want to finish this thought, but I was going to say earlier Aristotle's interesting to me in this regard, and it indicates where he's coming from a bit. He talks about virtues, let's say courage, and recognizes that courage may be a virtue, but some of us are more inclined towards rashness and others are more inclined towards cowardice. And we cannot say, generally speaking, which one it is for you. You have to know where your inclination lies and then work in the opposite. So if you tend to be rash, well, you need to consider that. If you tend to be cowardly, you need to consider that and work with it. Same with this person who has perhaps ambitious, he or she is ambitious or has other dispositions that have led that person to be manipulative, but it doesn't have to be that way, and presumably with flourishing, it wouldn't be that way.
That's fine.
Thank you. In your work, you mentioned that Aristotle's ethics are underdetermined in respect of general practical advice for flourishing. And I would think perhaps Ayn Rand's ethics is as well. Would you agree? And is your own work to that extent underdetermined, and does it have to be so? Is that a good thing? Like if you wade into the more precise individuated determination, you're not going to get a determination. You're going to get more and more practical guidance that wades into the field of psychology, or you end up with an endless set of illustrations.
Yeah, there are a number of things. I'll just come at it from my own point of view. I think Doug is with me on this. When I wrote about prudence, I actually argued in favor of underdetermination. And what I was trying to say at that time was experience matters. We cannot sit in our armchair and define ethics for everybody. That because of the individuated nature of flourishing, and also because of the nature of existence and life generally, I think we think that we cannot sit here and postulate a norm for every activity and define it as virtuous or not. That's a kind of casuistry, which I think we want to avoid. We don't want to sit and deduce obligations for people without any experience. I like the analogy of the common law. I mean, the common law, you have rules that exist and you learn from experience how to modify those rules to fit circumstances that may not have arisen before. That doesn't mean you get rid of the rules, but you pay attention to experience. And I think that's part of what we're after here. With if that's under determination, I think we're for it.
Yeah, let me just add, Aristotle's statement of the doctrine of the mean ultimately ends up saying that the mean is relative to us, meaning that, and by doctrine of the mean, he doesn't mean average, he means what's appropriate. Okay, so consider, for example, very general goods like knowledge or friendship, or virtues like temperance or courage. Okay, how we can say to people, well, go out there and pursue knowledge, go out there and pursue friendship, go out there and have courage. But what that looks like, that's a perfectly legitimate statement. But what that looks like as a reality, as opposed to an abstraction, is something very specific, in fact, very determinate. And that has to be discovered and achieved and maintained by the person, okay? And that person needs to know themselves, know thyself.
There's a large responsibility on each of us.
Huge. And back to all that understanding dispositions, and then learning how to put it in the proper form. And what practical wisdom does is it allows us to make those general goods, those generic goods, that as we speak about them are just abstract, we turn them into something determinate and real and valuable. Okay, before that, it's just a matter of thinking and knowing the good. But Aristotle's quite clear that what we're after about is not just knowing the good and not just doing the good, but being good, where ultimately these goods and these virtues constitute us, make us up. And so what we call underdetermination it's not underdetermined if what we're saying there isn't an answer there and it's just anything one wants to bring to it. Okay, so it does allow for determinate answers, but the determinate answers are not achieved from the philosophical armchair. You need the abstract, but you need to make that abstract real in light of your knowledge of the specific yourself and the specific characteristics. One other point, Aristotle uses the word nous, which is sometimes translated as insight. And insight goes in two directions. One, for knowing the universal and necessary, like the principle of non-contradiction, and also in knowing the particular and contingent. And the practically wise person is someone that has that insight, that can figure out, this is a person I should have friendship. This is the amount of time I should spend on this friendship relative to achieving knowledge, et cetera, putting all of that together. That's the kind of thing that. So I mean, we're definitely against sort of what we call a ethical rationalism that thinks that abstract reason alone can tell us what we ought to do. We're against that, but we're not against there being a determinate answer through practical wisdom.
Yeah, and you raised a very important term that I think is worth just mentioning, and that's responsibility. In our way of looking at things, this is what it comes down to. You're responsible for yourself and for making your life what it's supposed to be. And that's a critical term because it suggests at the same time awareness of what you are and where you want to be and what it's necessary for you to be who you are.
Last question of the day, if you will. If there is very serious misfortune, can we still flourish? I mean, can someone who was a top athlete, has an accident, has to give up his career, for instance, or whatever illustrations you want to have, is flourishing possible despite severe misfortune?
We've considered this, and maybe there is a base level, I don't know, but we've mentioned Solzhenitsyn. You can think of other people who have been in very dire circumstances who managed to, I think Richard Hare wrote his philosophy book while in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, things like that, it doesn't sound like flourishing because there's so much deprivation present. But as we look at flourishing in terms of utilizing the circumstances one finds oneself in to exercise one's dispositions, well, yes, those circumstances are still there. So that person may flourish even if pleasure is not exactly the mode of operation of where he or she is at. Doug may have things to add. Now, I don't know if there's a state that's so bad that there's no room for any sort of self-direction, then maybe there's no flourishing. But if there's room for self-direction, the possibility seems to us to still be there.
Yeah, I mean, the crucial thing about the Solzhenitsyn example is he had some self-direction, some things he could choose to do, or that. If that's completely blanked out, then you're in trouble. I always get a kick out of this example. We've used this. There were people outside a huge, horrific garbage dump outside of Manila. It was called Smoky Mountain, and these people they lived there, and they actually in the Philippines, and they actually not only were able to eke out an existence, but they developed products and turned around and sold them. Of course, when some big in a cosmetic effort to make Manila look better, the government, of course, eliminated the people being able to live there and all of that. That example, by the way, you'll find this ironic, I take from Paul Krugman.
All right, yeah, that certainly is ironic. But yeah, we know. I think Spinoza wrote much of his work when in house arrest in his last few years.
Well, it may be better also for philosophers in prison and that to be able to achieve something than for other people. I mean, none of this is to recommend living in a garbage dump or being in a gulag or anything like that. And it's certainly the case that for some people, these situations are absolutely destructive of a decent life, and which is why a good reason not to have them.
Try our best to avoid the Chinese prison where
Right.
Well,
no access to.
There's a story there that really scares me very much. Well, I don't want to go off topic, but that scares me very much, what I see going on in China.
Okay, well, we come to the end of the session for today, but it's been immensely useful, and I'm sure we'll call you back for a second session, but I think it is bye for now. I hope you enjoyed being on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. We'll see you shortly.